Hello, I'm Michael Wunsch. I'm the plant pathologist at the North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. I'd like to take a moment to share with you what we have learned about the efficacy of the fungicide Omega versus competitive standards for the management of white mold and dry beans. For Canadian listeners, Omega is marketed as Allegro in Canada. We conducted this testing in pinto beans in most studies and kidney beans in some studies. Row spacing was 14 inches. In most studies, seeding rate was either 90,000 or 80,000 viable seeds an acre. We applied the fungicides with a handheld spray boom, pressurized by carbon dioxide, with a spray volume of 15 gallons an acre. Fungicide droplet size was either fine or medium in the studies conducted from 2010 to 2021, and then calibrated relative to canopy closure in 2022 to 2024. We tested the fungicides with 2 sequential applications, with the first application at early bloom in initial pin pod, and the next application 7 to 14 days later, depending on the study. Studies were conducted with 5 or 6 experimental replicates. That's the number of times that we randomized the treatments and tested them across the footprint of the study. White mold was assessed at or near dry bean maturity by evaluating every plant individually for the percent of the plant impacted by white mold, and we did this assessment of individual plants in a minimum of half of the plot, so a minimum of half of the rows per plot. To ensure that variability in in dry bean standability did not bias yields, plants were clipped at the base concurrent with disease assessment, windrowed to dry, and manually lifted in the combine. We did not straight harvest these trials because invariably we have differences in the lodging and the standability of the dry beans across the footprint of the study. And when you straight harvest, the differences in the standability will be reflected in the yield data. And the standability of the dry beans did not always correlate to the white mold severity. And we straight harvested these studies, it would have been a lot less work, but we would have had a lot noisier yield data. We would have had much poorer quality data. And for that reason, we essentially knifed the beans. We clipped them at the base, windrowed them, put them out to dry, and then passed them through the combine. And this way we had a completely unbiased assessment of white mold of dry bean yield. Supplemental irrigation was applied to facilitate white mold disease pressure as needed to rigorously evaluate fungicide performance. I'd like to stress that this was testing conducted with 2 sequential fungicide applications, 2 applications of the same fungicide. It's not that we're recommending that, but what we wanted to do was rigorously assess efficacy. When you assess the same product twice sequentially, you get an additive effect of any differences in efficacy, and it makes it much easier to assess the comparative efficacy of 2 different application rates or 2 different fungicides. Okay, so we tested twice sequentially, but not with the purpose of recommending that. Our purpose was just to assess comparative efficacy. These results are meant to inform decision-making for a single fungicide application of the fungicide of interest, whether applied alone or in a rotational strategy with something else, or if you want to, apply the same fungicide twice sequentially. First off, Omega versus Endura. This is Omega applied at 13.6 fluid ounces, which is the high end of the labeled rate. And what you can see is that we do not have statistical separation with Endura, but you see a clear trend with Omega is performing better. Now, Omega at 13.6 fluid ounces versus Propulse. Same story. We do not have statistical separation here, but we have a clear trend where the Omega at 13.6 fluid ounces is performing better. Now, Omega at 13.6 versus Propulse at 8.6. Now we have statistical separation for the disease data. A clear trend in the yield data. No surprise that we now have statistical separation. Propulse exhibits a rate response, and lower application rates are less effective. Now, Omega at 13.6 fluid ounces versus Topsin at 30 fluid ounces. Likewise, you can see a rate response here. No statistical separation, but a very clear trend in both better disease management and higher yield with that application rate of 13.6 fluid ounces of Omega. Now, Omega is expensive, and so the temptation is to apply it at a lower rate. What happens when we cut the application rate of Omega to 8 fluid ounces? Well, what happens is that now suddenly Omega is not performing better than Endura or Topsin. There is no longer a trend towards better disease management with Omega once you cut the application rate down to 8 fluid ounces. What this means is that, just like all these other fungicides, Omega exhibits a rate response, and a higher application rate confers better white mold management than a lower application rate. What about Omega compared to Proline? In this case, you see statistical separation for the disease data and a clear trend on the yield data where the Omega is performing better. This is Omega at 13.6 fluid ounces again. So what have we learned? We've learned that Omega applied at the high application rate of 13.6 fluid ounces appears to be more effective than Topsin at 30 fluid ounces, Endura at 8 ounces, Propulse at 8.6 or 10.3 fluid ounces, and more effective than Omega at 8 fluid ounces. Omega at 8 fluid ounces, conversely, appears to be fairly similar in efficacy to those application rates of Topsin and Endura and the high rate of Propulse. In closing, I'd like to thank my staff, Aaron Faust, Swan Collis, Jesse Hafner, Gabby Henson. These are my current staff. Thomas Miorini, Billy Kraft, Michael Schaefer. These are my former staff. These individuals are highly dedicated. They work long hours, and it's their hard work that made this research possible. I'd also like to thank the staff in Langdon who contributed to this research. Scott Halley, when he was the plant pathologist in Langdon before he retired, and Amanda Ahrens, who was his research specialist. Amanda continues to serve in Langdon, but now under the new pathologist, Venkat Chopra. I'd also like to thank the funding support from the private companies, North Harvest Bean Growers Association, and the North Dakota Crop Protection Product Harmonization and Registration administered by the North Dakota Agriculture. These three funding sources were responsible for providing the funding that made this research possible. I'd also like to thank the companies, Bollingberg Seed Company, Green Valley Bean Company, and Kelly Bean Company in Hatton, North Dakota. These local companies provided us the seed and have provided us the seed for many years for our white mold fungicide management studies in Carrington and in Oaks. And they've done so on a donation basis at no cost. So give your sincere thanks to Kurt and John and Dean for their help. Thank you very much. I hope these results help inform your decision making and help make your crop successful. Thank you for your time.